I want Israel.
Seeing demonstrators in the Soviet Union roughed up by plainclothes policemen is not unusual. What is unusual is the claim that it's happening against the wishes of Soviet leader Gorbachev and is aimed at undercutting his program for change.
Within the bureaucracy, there must be and there are people who are against what is happening today in this country.
Hey, get off of me, pal.
Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is Nightline. Tonight, behind the scenes of the Soviet openness campaign. What are the risks Gorbachev faces? Can he be believed, and if so, can he win? Among our guests, former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Oh, how we love to judge the effectiveness of a national leader by how well he comes across on television. And let's face it, this one is awfully good. He can be alternately charming and stern, seems equally at ease with Hollywood stars and world leaders, and appears to have a clear vision of where he wants to take his country. But what you see on TV isn't necessarily what you get. Mikhail Gorbachev looks like a man in charge and certainly sounds like the man in charge, but depending on whom you listen to, Gorbachev is either well on his way to sweeping out all of Leonid Brezhnev's old allies or is still facing enormous opposition, with the jury still out on whether Gorbachev can bring his domestic opponents to heel. It is that fascinating internal power struggle in the Soviet Union on which we focus tonight. We begin with a look at the changes Gorbachev is trying to achieve. Here's Nightline correspondent James Walker.
For the past 2 years, Soviet Party officials and the Soviet people have lived through dramatic, unprecedented upheaval, the result of the efforts of party boss Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev has undertaken a campaign Russians call glasnost, or openness, designed to rally the people behind his attempts to restructure Soviet society and especially its sluggish economy. Within weeks of taking office, Gorbachev cracked down on drunkenness, government mismanagement, and corruption. At last February's party Congress, he began emphasizing the need for reform. In the last year, he moved to shake up the government and party officials.
He is creating uncertainty among large sectors of the population, particularly in the party, because he's shaking up the party. He's getting rid of a lot of deadwood, and they don't like uncertainty, and Gorbachev is an element of uncertainty.
Economically, Gorbachev wants foreign businessmen to be allowed to work inside the Soviet Union. Politically, he wants the electoral system changed to permit secret ballots. Militarily, he unilaterally halted Soviet underground nuclear testing despite continued American testing. Internationally, he said the invasion of Afghanistan was wrong and that eventually Soviet forces should be withdrawn. In an effort to reduce criticism abroad, Gorbachev began releasing imprisoned dissidents, over 140 so far. Among them, Andrei Sakharov, Anatoly Sharansky, and Yuri Orlov. In fact, Western observers think it was the ongoing release of dissidents that prompted these demonstrations last week in Moscow in an attempt to win freedom for jailed Jewish activist Joseph Begun. At first, there were no problems from Soviet authorities, but as the daily demonstrations continued, the trouble began. Protesters were jostled as uniformed police stood by and watched. Suddenly, one of the Soviet plainclothesmen cut the cable to the ABC News camera. On Thursday, the violence escalated.
Hey, get off of me, pal. Get out of here.
No.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
No.
All right, back off.
We're leaving. Get the...
Joseph Begun's son Boris was clubbed and kicked in the stomach. The beatings, according to Georgy Arbatov, a senior advisor to Gorbachev, had not been done by authorities.
You know, I don't know who these people were. I can imagine they could have been hooligans.
But American reporters in Moscow said they saw demonstrators led off by the so-called hooligans who drove away in vans belonging to Soviet police. Soviet expert Marshall Goldman says the heavy-handed response to the protesters is the latest example of opposition to the new policy of permissiveness.
This is not a society that has always treated individual rights with great care and affection. And yes, I think there's a very good chance that there was some of the dissent within the system to change is reflected by this violent outburst.
One clue to the Soviet power struggle, or disagreement about the handling of dissidents, came last Sunday with Arbatov's dramatic announcement about the fate of Joseph Begun.
And he would have been free several days ago. Wouldn't it be for this demonstration? He is free now, I can tell you. Well, the resolution, yes.
But today, 2 days after Arbatov's declaration, Soviet Foreign Ministry spokesman Gennady Gerasimov said Begun is still in prison, but will likely be released. Appearing on Nightline last night, Soviet commentator Vladimir Posner acknowledged that there is dissension within Communist Party ranks.
When Mr. Gorbachev speaks of revolutionary changes, I totally agree with him, but I would only add that where you have revolution, you also have counter-revolution. And you have people who don't want the changes to occur. What I'm saying is that within the society itself, within the bureaucracy, at different levels, there must be, and there are people who are against what is happening today in this country and who are trying to block it in whatever way they can, to compromise it, whatever way they can, to see that it doesn't work.
Indeed, at last year's party congress, Gorbachev drew criticism from Communist Party conservatives like Andrei Gromyko and Igor Ligachev, the second most powerful person in the Soviet Union. Gromyko warned, on the pretext of encouraging healthy and necessary criticism, no one must be allowed to resort to the fantasy of cracks in our party and in Soviet society. Criticism and vilification of honest communists are not the same thing. And Ligachev said, there has been good criticism of everything improper, but unfortunately some newspapers have permitted lapses, and Pravda's editorial office has not escaped this.
He's got all, almost major segments of the society opposing him. The workers, the bureaucrats, the military. About the only group that seems to be supporting him are the intellectuals, who are just very pleased that they are now given their head. And Gorbachev needs them. He wants them to help convince the others to write, to demonstrate, to show that indeed the society is moving forward and that they should support change in this kind of environment.
So Gorbachev's attempts to overhaul the system have not been without cost. Each reform has created more enemies, and unless he can consolidate his power, he could himself become part of the change. I'm James Walker for Nightline.
A little later, we'll be joined by Zbigniew Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor to President Carter and an expert on Soviet politics. But first, when we come back, we'll talk with Soviet expert Stephen Cohen, who was on hand at the Kremlin for Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's speech there yesterday.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by NutraSweet.
With us live in our New York studios is Stephen Cohen, professor of Soviet politics and history at Princeton University. Professor Cohen is just back from Moscow, where he attended the Soviet-organized International Forum on Peace and Disarmament, which was addressed by Mikhail Gorbachev just yesterday. I must tell you, while you were in Moscow yesterday, we had Vladimir Posner on the program last night. You just heard a segment of what he said. And in effect, what he was saying is here is an element, a part of the security apparatus, which appears to be so opposed to Gorbachev's policy of freeing the dissidents that they're trying to make that kind of trouble, that they're breaking up the demonstrations, hustling these people off. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me. Bear in mind that those were policemen, I think, not KGB, cops, militia. They're a major target of Gorbachev's anti-corruption campaign. There's bound to be opposition in their ranks. But we don't need that episode as evidence of opposition to Gorbachev. It's all over the Soviet press and elsewhere. There's plenty of evidence.
Oh, all right. Give me some of the evidence. Give us a couple of the high points.
Well, I guess the most dramatic evidence is what Gorbachev himself told a group of Soviet writers back in June 1986. It wasn't published. The Soviet Union was published abroad. He says there's opposition everywhere. There's a struggle underway. A lot of suffering accompanying the struggle, and that there are even disagreements in the Politburo.
Yeah, all right, let me play the skeptic for a moment. If I'm trying to get a lot of appreciation overseas for the enormous efforts that I'm making toward openness, no better way of doing that than to exaggerate the opposition that I'm experiencing at home. Any chance that that's what Gorbachev is up to?
Well, forgive me for saying, but that's an American perspective on Russia. There's a real political life in the Soviet Union. There's plenty of historical evidence that every reformer that's ever come to power in the Soviet Union has been faced by tremendous opposition. Why should Gorbachev contrive a scenario of opposition to please Americans? The problem with that view...
Well, I wasn't even thinking of Americans so much. I'm thinking, for example, much more of the Europeans. I think that much of what Gorbachev has been doing over the last few months has been directed not so much at the United States as at Western Europe.
Well, that might be, but the reality, I mean, whether you take the European or the American perspective, the problem is if you take that perspective, you lose sight of the great drama that's underway in the Soviet Union today. You have a reform leadership whose proposals are increasingly radical, with increasing opposition in one of the most conservative countries in the world today. It's a kind of historic struggle over the heart and soul and nature of a system created in the 1930s. And it's going to, Gorbachev himself said it's going to take generations for this struggle to have a conclusion, a definitive conclusion.
Without now just referring back to Gorbachev pointing to the opposition that he is experiencing, why don't you point to it? Where does it lie? In which elements of society? In the military, for example?
Well, I would disagree, for example, with Professor Goldman, who thought that whole segments of society are opposed. The more likely scenario is that there's friends and foes of change in every area of society. Some workers in favor, some against, some bureaucrats in favor, some against. But the main layer of opposition is the administrative bureaucracy that has run and managed the society since the 1930s. Because the essence of Gorbachev's program, as he and his people have set it out, is a major reformation of the Stalinist system, whereby the state controlled virtually everything, from raising pigs to writing poetry to industrial production. He's saying that the state can't sit on the neck of society any longer, at least so heavily, and that the state has to let go. He's advocated marketization, less censorship, more family farming, and in every area it means that a bureaucrat has to let go. So the result is he goes at the power and the privilege of a whole bureaucratic class, which is opposed, and at the same time he's attacking a 50, 60-year-old set of dogmas which are heartfelt and sentimental in the Soviet Union. It really is a powerful drama.
If you had to guesstimate at what his chances are right now at success, and in withstanding the opposition and indeed steamrolling over it, how great would you say that chance of success is?
I would say he has a better chance than Khrushchev had. I refer to Khrushchev because he was the first post-Stalin reformer, and he was overthrown in 1964. Gorbachev has the advantage of hindsight. He has the advantage of a more reform-minded, educated officialdom. But I would answer your question by quoting you what a Soviet friend told me last night in Moscow. He said that Gorbachev will either turn out to be the great historic figure of modern Russia or Don Quixote, the guy who dueled with windmills that eventually unsaddled him.
And Don Quixotes tend not to survive too long in the Soviet Union, or at least not in positions of political power.
Nothing is determined, though. I mean, there are a lot of people in the Soviet Union that identify with Gorbachev. His complaint has been not only about opposition, but that people standing on the sidelines, not willing to stick their neck out at lower levels where he can't protect them. It's those people, I think, in the long run who will determine the struggle. He will convince them that he's going to win or that he can protect them, and they will come forward as his allies all through the system. Or they will stand on the sidelines and the battle will go on. Let me say, though, that for me at least, the danger is not at the moment that Gorbachev will be overthrown as Khrushchev will be, but that the system will turn him into another Brezhnev, into another conservative status quo leader. We ought never forget that Brezhnev began in 1964-65 as a reform leader.
All right. Professor Cohen, I thank you very much indeed. I know you've had a long flight back from Moscow, and I appreciate you coming in. When we return, we'll talk with former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose books on the Soviet Union include Ideology and Power in Soviet Politics. Joining us now in our Washington Bureau is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor to President Carter, is currently a professor of government at Columbia University, and has been a distinguished Soviet affairs expert for many years. Let's start off from a very American vantage point, though, Dr. Brzezinski. What's in it for us? What difference does it make whether Gorbachev succeeds in liberalizing or is overthrown and some other fellow or troika of fellows takes over?
Well, quite frankly, I don't think it makes terribly much difference. It makes some indirect difference, perhaps, if in the long run the Soviet Union will become more responsive to domestic public opinion, if the quest for a better standard of living were to cut significantly into Soviet defense expenditures. But that's a long, long way off. I think in the meantime, it's important to concentrate on the real issues between us and deal with them on their merits, irrespective of what happens in the Soviet Union.
What do you think is going on, though, with Gorbachev right now? Every man who takes over in the Soviet Union, or group of men, go through a period of many months, sometimes even several years, of vying for power. Is that still in progress? Because sometimes we get the impression that Gorbachev really is on top of the mountain.
No, I don't think he's on top of the mountain. I think he represents a whole new generation that's by and large aware of what's wrong in the Soviet Union, but which isn't very clear in its own collective mind as to what ought to be done about it. So in that sense, he's riding the crest of a wave. But I don't have the feeling that, one, Gorbachev has around him people truly dedicated to him. Rather, he has people of his own generation who share some of his misgivings, some of his vague desires. And secondly, I certainly do not have the feeling, I do not, that he has a clearly thought-through program of reform. He's rather, in my view, groping for change, trying to rejuvenate the system, and as he's doing it, he's discovering, week from week, so to speak, almost, how difficult it is to change it, and therefore, in the process, he's somewhat escalating his rhetoric, and the internal contradictions are thus sharpening.
Now, within the context of the Soviet system, how much difference does it make if he gains enormous public support? Can public support, in fact, make a difference, or lack of public support cause a policy to totally fail?
Some public support is important, and I find it very interesting that he's relying so heavily on Soviet mass media. He's really waging a propaganda campaign, not only vis-à-vis us in the West, with that festival that he held recently in Moscow, organized for Western supporters or sympathizers with Soviet foreign policy, as the Soviets view them. But he's also doing the same domestically. He's orchestrating a campaign on behalf of change, on behalf of overtness. Not so much openness, because things are not being really openly discussed, but he wants the conduct of public policy to be more overt. And that, over time, could help him. But ultimately, he has to convince the ruling party machinery that it is in its interest somewhat to change the Soviet Union. And that, I think, is going to be very difficult.
The proponents, Dr. Brzezinski, of this policy of glasnost, of overtness or openness, or whatever you want to call it, are saying some of you, and they point at folks like you, are just too cynical. You're not even going to recognize it when it hits you over the head. But here, in fact, is someone who truly wants to change the Soviet system.
Well, Ted, I don't know whether he truly wants to change the Soviet system. He certainly hasn't said it. And I think we tend to read...
He talks about revolution. That's well, what he says. We are engaged in nothing less here than another revolution.
But he's mostly talking about reconstruction. And I think we have a tendency to read more into his words than he actually says. Even the introduction of this program by your colleague from ABC in Moscow said that Gorbachev had said it was wrong. That was his word. It was wrong for the Soviet Union to have invaded Afghanistan. Gorbachev never said that the Soviet invasion was wrong. He said that the problem is difficult, it's an open wound, but he would still like to solve it on Soviet terms. Now, inside the Soviet Union, I do give him credit for loosening things up. I think the Soviet press has become remarkably interesting. There is talk of change, there are reasonably accurate accounts of the riots in Kazakhstan, remarkable interviews with the head of the Soviet secret police, to whom people phone in a television program. So that is change. But let's not confuse it with democratization or even with liberalization yet. I think his model is not Hungary or China. His model is East Germany, an efficient, regimented, productive communist system.
And yet the East Germans are rejecting the very kinds of changes that he wants to make in the Soviet Union. They're saying, we want no part of changes like that.
East Germans don't need to make them. Their system works. The problem that he faces inside the Soviet Union is that the Russians are not Prussians. They're not as self-disciplined. They're not as dedicated. And he's going to find it very difficult, in my judgment, to loosen up, to make the economy more productive without generating serious political cleavages, not only in terms of the party apparatus perhaps becoming uneasy, versus his policies, but also in terms particularly of the non-Russian nations in the Soviet Union.
All right, hold on that point for a moment, because I want to come back to that when we return. And we will be back with our discussion with Dr. Brzezinski in just a moment. Continuing our conversation now with Zbigniew Brzezinski. Dr. Brzezinski, you were starting to talk about some of the problems that Gorbachev is going to have with the different nationalities. I assume you mean like the Muslims, 60 million of them in the Soviet Union. How is he going to deal with them?
Well, it seems to me that he faces here a true dilemma. If he tries to decentralize the Soviet economy, he inevitably sets in motion also political dispersal of authority. And that is anathema to the people in Moscow. This is why I do believe that there are certain objective limits to what he can do, and I expect the Soviet Union to face increasingly internal turmoil, and Gorbachev to find it increasingly difficult to move on.
Who are his main problems in the Soviet Union? I mean, do you agree with what Professor Cohen had to say, that a few opponents and a few supporters in each group, or do you take the view that, for example, the military or within the intelligence community, the KGB, that he faces problems?
I would say it's the structure of power, it's the party machinery, the party bureaucrats, some of the ideologues. I suspect some people are whispering that this is not another Khrushchev, a kind of Stalinist bumpkin, but perhaps another Bukharin, a guy who's pushing Soviet communism towards a more right-wing version of communism. And these could be serious doctrinal disputes. And I suspect as Gorbachev moves on, these dilemmas will emerge in sharper focus.
And can he, short of throwing people in jail or even executing them, as some of his predecessors had to do when they came up against severe political opposition, can he deal with them in a more benign fashion?
It's difficult. He can try to exile them, he can try to push them out. But one of the problems he has is that he doesn't have around him a group of people truly dedicated to him, kind of Gorbachevites. He has people who share some of his aspirations, but if he begins to stumble, they may abandon him. There is, as I sense it, no group personally dedicated to him, the way, for example, Stalin had a group of true Stalinists around him who were prepared to stick with him all the way.
Dr. Brzezinski, I thank you very much. It was good of you to come in and join us.
Nice to be with you.
That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
Adult illiteracy is a widespread problem. It's not limited to any single economic group, ethnic group, race, or region of the country. But a national movement is growing to overcome illiteracy. Everywhere, people in need are taking the courageous step to seek help, and thousands of others are volunteering to help them. If you need help, or if you can help someone else, call this number. It's never too late to learn to read.
For a printed transcript of this or any Nightline broadcast, please send $3 to Nightline Transcripts, 2 John Street, New York, New York, 10038. Nightline is a presentation of ABC News.